Thanks very much for having me. My name is Jonas. I am a postdoc at the Technical University of Munich. I am very much not an astrophysicist. I am actually a particle physicist. Um, and I will be talking about this sort of map making side of things that Thomas has hinted at. So I will basically go over the basics of how we basically simulate with Maria and then try to sort of wrap it up in how to reconstruct with the Gaussian process side of things. So this is what we'll do here. But again, not an astrophysicist, so I'll have to defer all of the very deep astrophysics questions to all of the friends mentioned here. Okay, this is a work, before I get into it, that I already presented at UKFCon 2025 and Universe AI. So there's the links here in the slides. I have a couple of links throughout the slides, and I'm happy to share them later if you're interested. Um, but yeah, you can also ask me if you have any questions about any links or stuff like that. Okay, so starting with Maria, basically this is the setup we already talked about. You have some telescope that is sitting on the ground. You're watching something in the sky through the atmosphere, and the name of the game that we want to talk about is the reconstruction side of things. So we already talked about how Maria handles the simulation. It's very flexible, it's super nice in the sense that you can just give it some input map, which is simulated, define your instrument and measurement plan, and then get time series for the atmosphere, the map, and the noise separately. And what we will do throughout basically the machine learning map making side of things is basically to use this infrastructure in order to give us a possible accurate reconstruction that is as accurate as possible. This is all still with simulation in mind, so we're still working on how to do this with data, but this is for later. Okay, so what this looks like is something that is a little bit like this. This is for a typical DAISY scan with Atlas. So most of the reconstructions that I show are actually going to be with Mustang because it's computationally much more feasible. But basically what you see is when you sort of loop over the sky in the DAISY pattern, you basically, every detector sees different information, and this information basically is useful to reconstruct the full image. And we're trying to basically keep track of which individual detector sees what and use that information in order to reconstruct something. So if you're wondering why it works or why it doesn't work, this is basically the name of the game here. Okay, so as I said before, we basically want to go from the time series to the reconstructed map. So we're basically asking the inverse question of how do we reconstruct. I think this is fairly basic stuff for you guys. Yeah, the problem, of course, is that the atmosphere is in the way. So when we have the atmosphere, which is not only fairly stationary and large scale, but it also fluctuates over time, which makes it very difficult to deal with for any type of reconstruction. And the basic idea that we had for this project is to not only, subtract some form of some sort of average atmosphere, but to actually model the atmosphere while we are modeling the map. And I'll try to talk to you guys through how we do this. And this is basically where NIFTy comes in. So if you're not aware how NIFTy works exactly, I will try to walk you through the basics. I can't do it justice in its full numerical complexity, let's say. But the basic idea of NIFTy is that it's a Python implementation of the information field theory framework developed by Thorsten Enslin. He gave a really great talk about this on the Tuesday of the Universe AI talk, which is linked here. But there's also the website, if in case you're interested, and multiple papers. The basic idea of NIFTy is basically that you model whatever image you're looking at as a two-dimensional Gaussian process. And then you use various very, very smart tricks, which I'll hint at later, to basically model the Gaussian processes a very efficient way so you can scale them to very high dimensions. So if you don't know exactly what a Gaussian process is, I'll try to sort of explain this as we go. But basically, it's just a machine learning model that gives you an approximation of some function in a possibly high dimensional space. And it basically, with every additional observation that you do, it conditions a high dimensional multivariate Gaussian to the observation that you do. So you not only get an estimate of a function value, but because it's a Bayesian thing and it's a Gaussian inherently, you automatically also get a uncertainty prediction, which is very useful, and we'll see more about that in a second. Okay, so conceptually, let's try to explain how we try to tackle this problem. So We start with the measurement equation. If we simulate something in Maria, we basically have this equation here. We have some input map, which we plug in as the signal. On this, we apply a measurement plan. And in this case, we have a very relatively simple daisy scan of, I think, 10 minutes observation for the Mustang 2 array. Then we add some atmospheric simulation on top, which is time dependent, as we can see here. And it basically works in the way that Thomas has explained before. On top of this, we add some shade of Gaussian noise, which can either be white noise or pink noise or something else. And that then gives us a prediction of the actual data in the end. What we're doing with NIFTy is essentially the same thing. We basically, instead of plugging in a truth map that we know, we basically plug in a two-dimensional Gaussian process, which is x and y dependent. So it's basically pixel by pixel, determines the function values of a map that you could potentially observe. On top of this, you apply some form of map sampling. So here we're using a JAXed version of the Maria mapper, where we are making some simplifications. As you can see, it's a relatively short function. So what Thomas just mentioned with the loading, for example, that is not exactly 100% represented here. So there's some simplifications here that we make, which we are still working on improving in the future. The atmosphere, we then basically add as a one-dimensional atmospheric GP component. So what this means is basically that we make the assumption that every single detector in the entire array sees the same exact numeric atmosphere. And this atmosphere is only time dependent. So it doesn't change between the actual array. It just gives you a flat atmospheric component. Obviously, this is a simplification. It's not actually true, but we'll see how far we can get with this. What's very nice about NIFTy is this basically allows you to marginalize over the white noise component directly, which means that you don't explicitly need to know the noise, but it's basically able to subtract it without taking it into account too much. It's a very elegant way of doing things, as we'll see in a second. And that gives you some prediction of what the data could look like for the specific Gaussian process map and atmosphere that you are basically considering. Now, I want to remind you here that basically we are writing this forward model in JAX. So basically that means that we have gradients going all the way from the predicted output data to the parameters of the input model. So to the parameters of the Gaussian process in the two-dimensional space and to the parameters of the Gaussian process in the one-dimensional atmosphere space. And if you know anything about machine learning, if we have gradients, we can basically use machine learning techniques and try to find an optimum. So we can reconstruct or find the optimal map and optimal atmosphere component that basically helps us in explaining or reproducing the predicted data as best as we can with the forward model that we're considering. That's basically how this pipeline works. There's a couple of sort of quote-unquote magic items in NIFTy, a couple of things that work exceptionally well here, and it's I want to go over them just very briefly, not in super much detail. But the idea is basically that you have a Fourier operator, which transforms the power spectrum in the harmonic space, which is diagonal because we're looking at a grid space, and the pixel by pixel excitations to sort of the real space. So that means that we have a very efficient sort of expression of the Gaussian process where we only need to know the power spectrum, and we actually get an explicit description of the power spectrum of our signals. So this is the map and the Gaussian process in the time domain for the atmosphere. So we get a power spectrum for those, and we also get the pixel by pixel excitations for those. It's a very efficient way of expressing the whole thing because we basically this way can express our model with millions of degrees of freedom, which typically for Gaussian processes is quite difficult to do. And then there's a couple of other things which are very efficient here. So the information field theory framework sounds complicated, and it very much is, but it's a very powerful statistics framework that just lets you, given the possible space of statistical hypotheses for your model, basically lets you find an optimum relatively efficiently. So when I was saying, okay, let's just use the gradients, we actually don't use gradient descent, but we use basically the techniques that are developed by Thorsten Enslin and others for NIFTy for basically finding an optimum and finding the best possible posterior in this potential space of hypotheses. Sounds very complicated, is very complicated, but basically what it means is just that using the technique that's called geometric variational inference, we can shape our posterior in such a way that the Gaussian process matches the or produces the best explanation of the data in the most efficient way possible. Since we're using variational inference here, we also have samples and uncertainties, as we'll see in a second. So this is very nice to have. And the biggest power of this whole process lies in the JEXT forward model, basically. Because what we can do using basically a JEXT version of our simulation pipeline is we have incorporated all of the physics knowledge about the system. So how does the detector behave when we're looping over the sky? We have incorporated that into our model. So our machine learning model, for example, doesn't need to learn how to produce from an input map a certain signal in the time domain, but we can just reproduce the input map, and then we will know, because we have the forward model, we will know where the spikes in the output map, in the output time domain are going to be. Yeah, so this means that we can, using this JEXT forward model, we can decompose the signal from the map, the atmosphere, and the noise, as we'll see in a second. And thanks to JAX.JIT, it's also reasonably fast. If you ever work with JAX, it's a very cool thing to work with. Okay, so let's go into the results. Basically, this is an example map reconstruction that we get. Again, we are simulating with Mustang 2 array, and it's about 10 minutes of observation. And this is a typical cluster, which I think is relatively bright. Sorry, it's not a cluster, it's a shadow of the CMB, sort of. And it's relatively bright, I think. But as you can see, we're basically able to reconstruct it fairly accurately. So basically going through this entire optimization pipeline, we can find some minor differences, I think, in the middle. As you don't think you can see my mouse, but in the middle, there's some differences between the mean and the truth, as you can see on the right-hand side. And this mostly is because we basically have a finite beam size. So there's some resolution effects that we can't necessarily pick up on. And on top of the sort of the map signal, we of course get a ginormous signal from the atmosphere, which we also are reconstructing at the same time here, which I don't have in the stock, but I have them in the backup if you're interested. What we also get is, on top of this, an uncertainty on the reconstruction, as I mentioned. So the whole idea of Gaussian processes is basically that it doesn't just give you a reconstruction, but it gives you basically a whole number of samples from your reconstruction. So in this case, we got 4 samples. So you basically can look at what the differences are between the samples, and they all look fairly similar, but on the edge, in white, in the samples on the right-hand side, you can see some differences. And using these, you can basically define standard deviation over them and see where the differences are the largest. For example, you can see the standard deviation on the bottom left here, where there's a little bit of red, is not entirely accurate. And also in the middle, there's some sort of effects that are still interesting. So basically, you have some diagnostic tools that are basically baked into the machine learning pipeline here, which are very useful to have because you get this uncertainty to work with in the end. Okay, in terms of final results, so we get a atmosphere, a map, and a noise reconstruction, as I said before. So let's look at this in the power spectrum. Basically, in the power spectrum here on the right-hand side, we see the map in the simulated versions of the map, atmosphere and noise in the dashed lines. The map is sort of this light blue cyanish. The atmosphere is yellow, and it sort of overlaps with the total, and for the most part, because it's very dominant at the low frequency range. And then the total noise, or the true noise, is given by the dashed purple line. And as you can see, we basically can very accurately reconstruct both the atmosphere and the map over many, many orders of magnitude here. So up to 10 orders of magnitude in the power, roughly speaking, and over about 3 orders of magnitude in frequency simultaneously. So this gives us a very powerful reconstruction to work with. One thing that's actually very interesting to note here is, as I said before, we basically don't account for anything else but white noise in this sort of noise subtraction. But as you can see in the power spectrum, we don't just have a white noise component, there's also a pink noise component. So if you look at the knee, where sort of at about 1 hertz-ish, where the prediction for the map deviates from the truth, and this is because the pink noise component starts to become more dominant. So this actually can't be subtracted fully by the NIFTy model as of now. and basically causes us to find some differences. So this is actually quite interesting because we also see some physics directly happening here, and also is something that we can basically improve on going forward by just making the noise model a little bit more flexible. Okay, so just in terms of some reconstruction comparisons, I said before, okay, we have this NIFTy reconstruction. This is now on the bottom left. The comparison NIFTy mean versus the truth reconstruction is in the middle, as we can see here. And then the maximum likelihood map is on the top left that we got, or that Yoshiba derived using Minkasi. And as you can see, we basically can improve upon the maximum likelihood fit by quite a bit here. And this is because we have, a powerful expressive machine learning pipeline to work with. So it's very, very nice. We can basically do this at arbitrary high resolution, and we can basically also reduce the residual by quite a bit while also getting uncertainties from the samples that we get, and also an atmospheric reconstruction at the same time. Now, the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is scaling this up from Mustang 2 to Atlas. So basically, all of the stuff that I showed you now and everything that we really have properly working and validated is for the Mustang array. So it's about 217 detectors. Obviously, if you want to scale this up to like Atlas sizes of arrays, then we have tens of thousands of detectors in a larger field of view. So this is where things get a little bit tricky. This basically is the domain. I said before that, okay, we are assuming that we have one Gaussian process that we use to express the entire atmosphere response. And this is sort of the domain where things start to break down here. So we can still get an accurate reconstruction for Mustang, but for Atlas, this is a little bit more tricky. So this means that we basically need to model the atmosphere response with multiple Gaussian processes. So we get basically one Gaussian process for the map and multiple Gaussian processes for the atmospheres. So this is where things start to get very expensive. So far, we've been able to push this until, I think, 500 or so Gaussian processes at the same time. But this was running on one H100, which is 90 gigabytes of RAM, and it's a very expensive GPU. So this definitely has some, room for improvement, let's say, in the computational efficiency side of things. But okay, another issue with this is that it can sort of introduce some degeneracies between the detectors because the information of what detector sees which part of the map no longer directly corresponds to information of the map because there's also different components of the atmosphere that can sort of enter in the same place. So it's very difficult to disentangle this a little bit. And the way we try to tackle this is basically by first simulating with Maria, as we saw before. So we get various different atmosphere responses. And then we model all of these subarrays with one Gaussian process for the atmosphere. And then we start to split things up. So we first split horizontally or vertically. And then we basically fine-tune the individual atmosphere responses. And then we start to basically split this up and we go further and further until we basically reached an optimum. And using this kind of technique, now this time with Atlas, this is a very preliminary result, work in progress, of course. But what we are able to get is a sort of optimal reconstruction for 64 subarrays. So we're basically using 65 Gaussian processes total with about 14 million or so degrees of freedom. So really big machine learning reconstruction. But we're able to reconstruct this pipeline, this cluster here on the right-hand side relatively accurately. And this is sort of the array configuration. But again, this is a very, very preliminary, all work in progress, and we need to tune this in order to actually say more. Okay, this already brings me to the end of my talk. So I showed you how we can basically use this machine learning pipeline. We're able to not only accurately reconstruct maps, but we can also get a atmosphere reconstruction at the same time and uncertainties, which is very nice. So this does work. We're now working on reconstructing real Mustang 2 data. So far it's basically been a self-consistency test where we simulate with Maria and then we reconstruct that simulation using this same pipeline. Yeah, so there's a couple of technical things that we have ongoing. It's basically overlaps very much with what Thomas mentioned. So we want to have a more complete noise model, as I said, and then also going multi-frequency and actually being able to reconstruct the CMB itself would be extremely nice, and also adding point sources. and scaling the things up for computational intensity. Yeah. So if you want to try it out, there's a link here. There's also a QR code here, which should work and take you to the repo. We are really improving the user friendliness of it all. So if you want to give it a go, just try it out. If you want to help out and collaborate, just get in touch.